In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy threw a rock into a cave in the Judean desert and heard something shatter. He climbed in. What he found were ancient manuscripts sealed in clay jars, hidden for over 2,000 years. They contained the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible ever discovered. Documents that permanently changed how scholars understood the origins of both Judaism and Christianity. 60 years of study followed, thousands of scholars, hundreds of publications, a chronological framework built painstakingly by hand, letter by letter, scroll by scroll. By 2024, most experts believed they had a solid grip on when these manuscripts were written. Then an AI named Enoch read them and told the scholarly world it had been getting the dates wrong, in some cases, by a full century. Stay with this, because what Enoch found does not just affect ancient history. It changes the terms of a conversation that has been running for 2,000 years, about when the Bible was actually written, by whom, and whether any of it was composed close enough to the events it describes to matter. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found between 1947 and 1956. 11 caves near Qumran in the West Bank. Roughly 1,000 manuscripts and fragments, written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Every book of the Hebrew Bible except Esther, plus hymns, legal codes, apocalyptic writings, and texts belonging to an ancient Jewish sect. The oldest biblical manuscripts ever found. And for decades, dating them accurately was one of the most contested problems in ancient textual scholarship. The standard method was paleography, the analysis of handwriting styles. Experts examined the shapes of individual letters, compared them to other dated manuscripts, and estimated when a scroll was written based on how the script evolved over time. It sounds rigorous. It was not. Paleography is deeply subjective. Different scholars examining the same scroll frequently disagreed on its date by decades, sometimes longer. And there was a structural problem nobody could solve. Almost no independently dated Hebrew or Aramaic manuscripts existed from the period between the 4th century BC and the 1st century AD, which is precisely when most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written. Paleographers were comparing handwriting styles without enough fixed reference points. Their dates were educated guesses dressed in scholarly authority. That is the problem Enoch was built to solve. The Enoch AI model was developed by a team led by Professor Mladen Popovic at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. The project was funded by the European Research Council and named, deliberately, after the Hebrew prophet Enoch, a figure ancient tradition credited with uncovering hidden patterns in the world. An appropriate name for a machine trained to find hidden patterns in ancient ink. Here is the mechanism, and it is worth understanding precisely. The team identified 24 Dead Sea Scroll fragments that had already been dated using radiocarbon analysis. Physical dating, measurable, empirical, no subjectivity. They fed high-resolution photographs of those 24 scrolls into the AI and trained it to map the geometric shapes of individual letters against the known carbon-14 dates. Think of it like this. Imagine you could photograph every fingerprint ever left at a crime scene, feed them into a single system, and ask that system to find patterns invisible to any individual detective. Enoch did the equivalent with ancient handwriting. It learned to read the microscopic evolution of Hebrew script the way a forensic expert reads biological evidence, tracking details no human paleographer could consciously monitor across 1,000 manuscript fragments simultaneously. Once trained, the team set it loose on 135 undated scrolls. The results, in the researchers' own words, were staggering. Approximately 80% of the time, Enoch's date predictions were older than the estimates made by human paleographers. In some cases, by 50 years. In some cases, by a full century. Scroll scholars had assumed were written in the 1st century BC were being placed by Enoch in the 2nd century BC, or earlier. Some fragments were being dated to a period before the Roman Empire existed at all. Now here is the question that actually matters. Why does 50 years make a difference? Because the dates of these manuscripts are not academic trivia. They are primary evidence in arguments about some of the most fundamental questions in religious history. When were the books of the Bible actually composed? In what political context? Were certain texts written during the lifetimes of the figures they describe, or centuries after the fact? These questions have driven scholarly debate for generations. The dates of the Dead Sea Scrolls sit at the center of that debate. Two specific findings from the Enoch study demand attention. First, the Book of Daniel. Two fragments designated 4Q114 were dated by Enoch, significantly earlier than traditional estimates. This matters because Daniel is one of the most contested texts in all of biblical scholarship. Arguments about its date of composition have run for centuries. Earlier dating shifts the terms of that argument in ways scholars are still working through. Second, the Book of Ecclesiastes. Enoch placed fragments of Ecclesiastes in the 3rd century BC, earlier than most scholars had considered possible. Many academics had long assumed Ecclesiastes was a late composition, written well after the world it describes. These findings push that assumption back by generations, and force a rethink of when and why this text was actually written. Here is the question worth sitting with for a moment. If the scrolls are consistently older than we thought, what else about the timeline of the Hebrew Bible have we been getting wrong? Before you answer that, understand what the study does not claim. Enoch is not infallible. The researchers acknowledge that 21% of its predictions were judged by human experts to be too old, too young, or indecisive. The model was trained on 24 scrolls. That is a small foundation for conclusions this large. The researchers themselves describe Enoch not as a final authority, but as the beginning of a new empirical approach, a tool that gives human scholarship a measurable baseline to argue from, rather than replacing the argument. Before Enoch, paleographers had no fixed reference grid. They were estimating dates by comparing one uncertain manuscript to another. Now there is a machine that has mapped patterns across the entire surviving corpus of Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts and produced probabilistic date ranges grounded in physical radiocarbon data. That is a structural shift in how this field operates. Not a conclusion, a new foundation. And then there is the detail that genuinely stopped scholars in their tracks. For the first time in 60 years of Dead Sea Scroll research, two biblical scroll fragments can now be confidently linked to the era in which their authors are thought to have lived. Read that again slowly. Manuscripts produced close enough in time to their described events that the chain of transmission is not a matter of centuries, but of decades, possibly of living memory. Does that prove the biblical accounts are historically accurate? No, it does not. Proximity in time is not the same as accuracy of content, but it dramatically changes the parameters of the conversation. And in a field where scholars have been arguing from the same uncertain chronological framework for 60 years, changing the parameters is an achievement of the first order. The team at Groningen are now expanding Enoch's training set, feeding it more radiocarbon-dated material to sharpen its accuracy. And they are beginning to apply the same methodology beyond the Dead Sea Scrolls entirely. Egyptian papyri, early Christian manuscripts, any ancient text collection with sufficient surviving material. A new era of AI-assisted ancient textual scholarship has begun, and it started with a shepherd boy throwing a rock into a cave in the Judean desert. Next week, we stay in biblical archaeology, but we go somewhere completely different. A city in western Turkey, a city mentioned by name in the New Testament, a city the Apostle Paul wrote a personal letter to 2,000 years ago, Colossae. Until very recently, nobody had ever seriously excavated it. In 2025, archaeologists began the first systematic dig at Colossae, and almost immediately, they found something that stopped the entire team cold. Not pottery, not coins, not the ordinary debris of an ancient city. 60 rock-cut tombs, carved directly into the hillside, sealed, intact. Never opened since the people who carved them walked away 2,000 years ago. 60 tombs, at a city Paul wrote to, never opened. What is inside them? Who were these people? And what does a sealed ancient necropolis at a New Testament city tell us about the world in which early Christianity was born? That is next week, Calibrated Past, where ancient evidence meets modern science.